by starting right here at our university campuses. My name is Felix. I'm the national coordinator for Students for Liberty in Germany, and I will be a host for tonight. Some people say that in times of the corona crisis, it is not a good time to talk about libertarian topics. Well, there is nothing really to say except that they are dead wrong. Today's speaker is a Swedish author and historian of classical liberal ideas. His most popular works include The Defense of Global Capitalism and Progress, 10 Reasons to Look Forward to the Future. He's also a successful documentary filmmaker and the only person that I know whose hair has its own Facebook fan page. Let me welcome you to the Spring for Liberty, Johan Norberg.
Thank you very much, Felix, and what a nice introduction. And thank you for the invitation. I hope you're all safe and that you're not spending too much time with your older relatives at the moment. Let me just say this about the pandemic. If you were gonna choose one year in world history to suffer through a pandemic so far, it would be 2020. That's the best one so far when it comes to the ability of both scientific and technological breakthrough and abilities to communicate and try to keep some of the economy working despite the fact that we can't go out and socialize.
Well, definitely, and this is going to be part of our Q&A. I assume there are going to be some questions about, progress and about how to get through this time. But the topic of today is something slightly different. So I'm just going to outline the agenda real quick. There's going to be a talk of you about the myth of Sweden's socialism for roughly half an hour. And then we're going to jump into a Q&A, which is going to last another half an hour. And we're going to cover some topics ranging from the Swedish socialism. Then we have a free part of the Q&A, which we're going to, talk about your works in general. All
Sounds
right.
Great.
With that out of the way, this stage is yours, or in this case, the screen.
Thank you so much. So the myth of Sweden's socialism. What is that? What's the myth? Well, the myth is that Sweden is successful and a fairly decent and wealthy society because of socialist policies. And indeed, it's a myth that Sweden is a socialist country at all. So let me explain what I mean when I say that. When people say that we should be, I tell my socialist American friends, when they listen to their Bernie Sanders or their Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and they say they're being asked sort of what's a successful example of a socialist economy, they often return to Sweden. And I try to tell them that if you really wanted to be like Sweden, you would have to do some interesting changes. You would need more free trade, in many instances more open markets. You would have to abolish occupational licensing and many of the sort of guild trade associations that block competition in certain areas. You would have to reform social security, pension benefits, from a system of defined benefits to a system of defined contributions, partially privatized with individual accounts that you're allowed to invest in the stock market yourself. You would also have to open up the public system of public services, introduce school choice with a national system of school vouchers, and you would have to abolish taxes on wealth, property, gifts, and inheritance. So this tells you if this is socialism, it's at least not your granddaddy's socialism. It's not what we usually think of as socialism. On the contrary, it's a system based on private property and very strong competitive multinational companies constantly forced to expose themselves to the competition of the rest of the world. And in fact, it seems in a way that there aren't that many socialists in Sweden, at least if you compare it to a country like the US. I saw in a recent US poll that 36% of Americans are positive to socialism, including 16% of self-described Republicans, which is interesting because if you ask Swedes the same thing, only 9% identify themselves as socialists. So in fact, there are more socialists in the American Republican Party than in Sweden, proportionally. And there's a simple reason for that. We learned from our mistakes. We learned from our experiments with some socialist policies. The reason why lots of people associate Sweden with socialism is the same reason they associate it with ABBA music and free love. Their perceptions are stuck in the 1970s. At that time, it was reasonable to say that Sweden was moving towards socialism, but this was an aberration in Sweden's history, and this was an aberration that almost destroyed Sweden. So let me give you the crash course in Swedish history, and it actually ends with a crash, so that's kind of fitting. Sweden has a very strong classically liberal history because at the end of the 18th century, Sweden was a fairly authoritarian monarchy with no freedom of speech, no free markets, no free trade, no individual liberties, no individual property rights for farmers and so on. But we had some individuals, like, for example, Anders Chydenius, who was a priest in a very poor, destitute part of the then eastern part of Sweden, which is now Finland, who met the farmers and the poor peasants and realized that it wasn't that they were lazy, it wasn't that they were stupid or anything. They worked very hard, but they had to work very hard to make ends meet and to get around all the corruption, all the regulation, all the taxes coming from Sweden. So he became a forceful proponent of liberal ideals, read some of the Enlightenment philosophers at the time, and began to expose them in a very systematic way, combining natural rights ideology with a minimum state, with a defense of an economic system of free markets, private property, and free trade. And he outlined this in one of his writings. 11 years before Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations, Anders Chydenius wrote The National Gain, where he explained that we will be incredibly prosperous in Sweden if we just allowed people to go about their business in their own way, because then the system of free prices will coordinate people's labor, and they will do the kind of work that will benefit others the most, as long as rules, regulations, and taxes don't keep them out of it. And he became a member of parliament in Stockholm, where he implemented some of these policies in the 1760s, but most of all, he implemented the world's first sustainable freedom of the press constitution. And that's one of the reasons why he's gone down in history. We had that opened up the debate, that opened up the discussion, and then we got this guy in Sweden, Johan August Gripenstedt. Johan, same name as someone else that you might have heard of. And he was a politician, a nobleman, but sort of being more identified with the farmers who wanted to escape protectionism and some of the city folks who wanted to escape rules, the guilds, and so on. He went to France. He was inspired by Frédéric Bastiat, the economist, and other classical liberals. And he became a very powerful figure in the mid-19th century in Sweden, where he, as a Minister of Finance, he began to open up for freedom to start businesses, freedom to trade with the rest of the world, made Sweden join the English-French free trade pact. That was very important. Many other European countries joined this. And Sweden at that time also opened up for more freedom of religion, free immigration and emigration. And this, at this point in time, in the late 1850s, he said that if we do this, if we implement free markets and free trade and individual liberty, Sweden, one of the poorest countries in Europe, will in the future be one of the richest countries on the planet. Just bear with me. And people just taunted him for years and harassed him, especially after 1865, when he had to leave his post for health reasons. They said that, oh, now he's leaving, now that he's implemented this radical liberal change of system. Now he's left us before we'll see the devastating effects on our economy. The result was quite the opposite. The result was the fastest growth rates that Sweden has ever had, a rapid increase in mechanization and industrialization, and people began to start different mutual associations to create their own ways of creating welfare services on a private basis, mutual associations, insurances, and so on, and very competitive international businesses. A very small government, very low taxes, 100 years of rapid economic growth, and 100 years later, Sweden was not the richest country in Europe because Switzerland beat us to it, but we were the second one. So in effect, Kripenstedt was right about all these things. If you combine these policies for almost 100 years, combined with staying out of 2 world wars, suddenly in 1950, Sweden had become the 4th richest country on the planet. And there was nothing mysterious about this progress because Sweden was also the 5th freest economy in the world at that time. If you try to use the economic freedom of the world statistics and go backwards in time. And back then, in 1950, taxes in Sweden were just 21% of GDP, lower than in the United States and roughly 10 percentage points below the level in countries like West Germany, France, and Britain. So, you know, that story about how could Sweden combine socialist policies with being so incredibly successful economically and socially? Well, the answer to that question is the same as that old joke. How can you end up with a small fortune? Well, you start with a large fortune and then you waste some of it and then you'll have a small fortune left. That's what it was all about, because before Sweden had built this big welfare state, before Sweden had increased taxes more than others, regulated the labor market and so on, Sweden had already become one of the richest countries on the planet. And that's exactly what caught the interest of some people, including the Social Democrats in Sweden, people like Gunnar Myrdal, who got the, you might remember him as being the Nobel laureate in economics, sharing it with Hayek in 1974, but with very different policies. The title of this one is The Planned Economy in the Welfare State, trying to explain how we can regulate everything. What Gunnar Myrdal said, and his wife Alva Myrdal, also a Nobel laureate actually, said that this is the place, Sweden is the perfect place to experiment with socialism. This is the place to build a welfare state, because everything is here that you need. All the ingredients that we need to build a successful welfare state is here. We already have the wealth. We're already one of the richest. So it's not a problem if we sort of stifle that progress in some way. But we also have a very strong tradition of having a work ethic. People work hard, and they work hard even though it might be the case that you have high taxes on work and nice benefits if you don't work, but also a system of trust, trust in your in your neighbors, and trust in politicians and bureaucrats, that the politicians wouldn't waste your money if they got it, and that people wouldn't abuse the benefits. And Myrdal was very influential. The Social Democrats were always in power, basically, after 1932. And at first, they were very cautious, influenced by liberal economists who said that we need a system of free markets to have something to distribute. But they got cocky. They got cocky in the 1960s, but specifically in the 1970s and 1980s. In just 20 years, public spending in Sweden doubled from 31% to 60%. They increased taxes on everything. They regulated most businesses and the labor market. And they even began toying with ideas about socializing means of production, the system called the Wage Earners Fund, where they had the idea that businesses would be forced to put some of the resources into a specific fund, whereby trade unions and the governments basically ate the company and bought shares with it. And this is what the world still remembers about Sweden. At the precise moment, the 1950s, 70s, when socialism attained its highest international prestige, here was a very small, democratic country, which seemingly proved that socialism and wealth could be combined. They looked at Sweden in the 1970s. You're one of the richest countries on the planet, and you implement these semi-socialist policies. It's great. We should do the same thing. But it was just, that leap, the logical leap is, I tried to explain it once to someone by saying, it would have been like taking a snapshot of Elvis Presley at the same time and conclude that the way to become the king of rock and roll was to just waste your days eating banana and bacon sandwiches with prescription drugs. Because that's not really the lifestyle that got Elvis Presley into that position. And these weren't the policies that took Sweden to that particular position. It's just the thing that we did once we got there. And these policies were the opposite, basically, and it almost destroyed the country. Even though the rest of the world looked at Sweden and thought that, wow, that's the way to do things. This was, in effect, Sweden's Atlas Shrugged moment. Because this was the moment in a time when the great innovators, entrepreneurs, individualists started to leave Sweden because the climate wasn't very hospitable to innovation, creativity, to investment, and to business. IKEA, the big furniture company, left for the Netherlands and Switzerland. Tetra Pak left for Switzerland. Ingmar Bergman, our great film director and theater director, left for Germany. Bjorn Borg, our best tennis player, left for Monaco. They all left Sweden, and Sweden began to lag behind in a dramatic fashion. In the early 1990s, when economists looked at our past, it turned out that we hadn't created a single net job in the private sector since 1950. That told us that something was wrong. And only one of the 50 biggest companies on the Swedish stock market, just one had been created after 1970. So that tells you that these weren't the policies that created the wealth. Quite the contrary, it destroyed it. And the whole system came tumbling down in a dramatic way later on. It began with a slow but steady lagging behind other countries. From the 1950s and onwards, we began to grow poorer than the others. We used to be 10% richer than the other countries in the OECD club of rich industrialized countries. 10% richer. Well, by the end of this, we were almost 10% poorer than the average. And it collapsed in a terrible financial crisis in the early 1990s because it had been sustained by a debt and inflation fueled boom. This collapsed, and for a while, the Swedish central bank even had to implement an interest rate of 500% to defend the Swedish currency. not 5%, which would be quite extraordinary in this day and age, but 500% for a while, just to make sure that the Swedish currency didn't collapse completely. And at this time, one spectator said that this has failed. The Swedish experiment with socialism has failed. It is unsustainable, it is absurd, it is rotten, and it is perverse. And this wasn't just anyone. This was the Social Democratic Minister of Finance, Kjell-Olof Folgt, who thought that we need something very different. So the bottom line is that socialism didn't even work in Sweden. Gunnar and Alva Myrdal said that, basically, if it doesn't work in Sweden, it won't work anywhere, because we've got the foundations, we've got the pillars, everything, all the preconditions that we need to build socialism. Well, it didn't work in Sweden. It undermined the wealth, it undermined the wealth creation, it undermined entrepreneurship and innovation and business creation and job creation, but it also undermined those characteristics that Gunnar Myrdal had talked about. It undermined trust in others and in the government. In 1960, the percentage of Swedes who said it was okay to lie to obtain a government benefit was just 5%. 40 years later, that percentage had climbed to 43%, from 5% to 43%. So, culture isn't destiny. That culture came from something. It came from the kind of economic and cultural incentives that Swedes had until the 1950s. When they began to undermine those incentives, the culture began to change. And then people also began to obtain more government benefits than they wanted, and they stopped adhering to that traditional work ethic. My favorite example of how Swedish behavior changed because of this generous welfare state is sick leave benefits, which were incredibly generous for a while. You could get some 80% of your previous wage if you were off sick, and very lax checks on whether you were really sick or not, which resulted in one of the healthiest populations on the planet, objectively speaking, were suddenly off sick from work more than any other population. And suspiciously often during large sporting events. During the Soccer World Cup of 2002, men's short-term sick absence increased by 41%, whereas it did not change for women at all, but 41% for men. And we didn't even make it past the 8 finals at that time. As Gunnar Myrdal, you might remember him, the great thinker behind Swedish socialism, put it, Sweden has become a population of cheats. All those things that I admired in Sweden, they seem to be gone. And his grandson, Stefan Fölster, who is a prominent Swedish economist, he put it this way when I interviewed him for a documentary I made on this called Sweden Lessons for America, ? Which is online and available if you're interested. He put it this way: towards the end of his life, my grandfather, Gunnar Myrdal, questioned many of his lifelong assumptions. He saw that things were not working as they had planned for it. End of quote. So that's our experience with Swedish socialism. It was a complete and utter failure. And the Social Democrats were the first, in a way, to admit it and say that we had to change our ways. And we did change our ways in the 1990s in quite a dramatic way. Starting first with a center-right government under Prime Minister Carl Bildt, but then with in many instances support from the Social Democrats, and then upheld, and in some ways for a few years, the Social Democrats even went further and liberalized in more ways. What happened during this new period of change in Sweden was that the size of the government was reduced by 1/3. They reduced taxes on incomes and the marginal tax rate. They abolished taxes on wealth, on property, on gifts, on inheritance. They privatized many state companies. They liberalized product markets and implemented more free trade than before. They opened up for private providers in the public sector with a school voucher system, and private providers in healthcare, and a social security reform, so that pension benefits were changed in a dramatic fashion from defined benefits to defined contributions, so that it's always supposed to be economically sustainable. If the economy tanks, so do the pensions, which nobody likes, but nobody likes a collapse in the social security system either. And in the European Union today, it's extraordinary. As an old sort of libertarian critic of everything that Sweden was doing, it's astonishing to see Sweden in Brussels being one of the most reliable voices for free markets, for free trade, for more competition and less spending. And the result of all of this is that Sweden got back on its feet. We got back to our future. Interestingly, one of the ministers of finance who has been instrumental in implementing some of these reforms, Anders Borg, he had on his office wall 2 portraits. One of Johan August Gripenstedt, the Minister of Finance who reformed Sweden dramatically, and one of Anders Chydenius, the father of Swedish liberalism, who gave Swedes many of these ideas to start with. And the result was that Sweden began to beat the others again, became the rock star of recovery, as Financial Times put it, after the financial crisis. Between 1970 and 1990, even before the great financial crisis that Sweden had in the early 1990s, Sweden grew almost 1% slower than our major trading partners, the other industrialized economies. After 1995, Sweden has grown almost 1% faster. Between 1970 and 1995, when the world thought of Sweden as a workers' paradise, inflation ate almost all of their wage increases. Incomes didn't grow for 25 years. Since 1995, they've increased by almost 70%. So that's Sweden's story. Free markets made Sweden a rich, decent, functioning society. Free markets, free trade, and a limited government. We experiment with socialism during a brief period in time, but that period almost destroyed us. And now we are getting back slowly but steadily to the future. It's not like Sweden is any kind of perfect society, and we do have some major problems left, but now we have the normal problems of a normal, mature, late European welfare state society, not any kind of aberration compared to these. Our social spending as a percentage of GDP is 26%, which is almost exactly the same as Germany's, and much lower than France's, for example, at 31%. And to sum all of it up, as Kjell-Olof Feldt, the Social Democratic Minister of Finance, put it, that whole thing with democratic socialism was absolutely impossible. It just didn't work. There was no other way to go than market reforms. Or, in the words of Göran Persson, who is the most successful social democratic prime minister of the modern era, 1996 to 2006, when he told Swedish television that he wouldn't call himself a socialist. Why? They asked. Why wouldn't you call yourself a socialist? He said, oh, you just become equated with so many crazy people. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Now that I heard your presentation, I get a pretty good understanding on how this myth originated. The second question for me is, why does it still stick around? Why do people like AOC, why do people like Bernie Sanders still use Sweden as an example of socialism? And the same people are very quick to drop their praise of, for example, Venezuela, which has way more which way closer resembles a socialist, society when you look at the means of production. Why do those people still stick to the label? Was it because Sweden didn't fail hard enough?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and that's exactly the correct answer. The reason why they always return to Sweden sooner or later is that every other role model that they point to end up with breadlines, with labor camps. And it's like, for a while, they always point to, look, Cuba can do it. They can do it. Oh, no, it's Sweden. That's the real story.
Right.
And then it's Venezuela. Look, they can do it. And no, that was never real socialism. Sweden, though, Sweden has always, even during the times of deep economic crisis, Sweden has always been a fairly decent society without the breadlines, without running out of state produced toilet paper, and without becoming a dictatorship. And so it always seems like a fairly tempting alternative to what they've got. So that's the one reason all the other alternatives fell. But that doesn't explain why they haven't updated the story to what has really happened in Sweden. And I have to think that there's got to be some American insular attitude there. They haven't. They look at a country once every 50th year or something like that, and they don't update their perceptions. Whereas some people in continental Europe do. And that's interesting when you listen to some socialists in France, for example. They say that Sweden is the worst example right now because they are the sort of the neoliberal model where they've deregulated much more than everybody else. And that's going to be horrible in the end.
Well, with that out of the way, we would open up the Q&A to everybody. The first question comes from Bill via YouTube. Switzerland has preserved its liberalism through a relatively conservative population. How would you describe the Swedish people and their political heritage? How are university students now or of today?
That's very interesting. And I wouldn't want to go out on a leash and sort of be too certain about the sort of Swiss national identity, but I would suggest that there's a tiny bit of a difference. It's a more cautious, conservative population in a cultural way, no experiments, and through the cantons, through the decentralized political system, more checks and balances. It's difficult to go dramatically wrong in a national fashion with that. Swedes are different. Swedes are a little bit we're a more centralized society to begin with, but also a cultural attitude that makes us more willing to adapt to the latest fashion, whether it is a new way of interior design or new policies or new technologies. We want to be early adopters, and especially then if people in charge, and we have a traditional consensus-oriented mentality, if they say that this is the way to go about things, we'll do it. And in a way, that's a bad thing because it means that we can make bigger mistakes than others. If the whole establishment, and this was also a consensus from the left to the right in the 1970s, said that even though the Social Democrats and the Left Party went further, the sort of the center-right parties, they said, yeah, we want the same thing, but just a little bit sort of cheaper and a little bit worse than others. Everybody does it, and we go further and make bigger mistakes than others before we change course. I think if you're interested in a sort of the cultural background, I think it's partly because it's a small homogeneous country where whoever is in charge is probably your second cousin or the old roommate of your now girlfriend's best friend. or something like that, we know everybody and we think they're not out to get us. If they want to do this, it's probably for a good reason. The good thing is that when we realize that this is a terrible disaster, we've made these mistakes, we've approached a precipice, then we can quickly turn around. And that's what happened in the 1990s. From the left to the right, we made much bigger reforms than other countries did. And if you look at the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World data, Sweden liberalized more from 1980 to 2000 than Reaganite United States or Thatcherite Britain. Granted, we started from a lower level, but yet that tells you something. So that's one of the reasons why we make the biggest mistakes in Sweden, but we're also quicker to turn things around when we've realized it. That doesn't tell you where we are right now and what happens at the universities and so on. I would say that in most places, you would say, and especially if you look at a Hayekian sort of perspective on how ideas go through a population, you would think that universities started. I think in Sweden, they're more of a lagging indicator of things that are changing elsewhere. And I think it's more like events, and dramatic events change perceptions in a dramatic way. And then something starts happening in universities as well. They're not at the forefront. Often, on the contrary, I'd say some of the think tanks and some politicians are often more sort of early adopters of new policies. Where are we now? We're somewhere in the middle of everything. No, not much better, not much worse than anybody else.
All right, let me dig deeper into the economic freedom. So there's another question from YouTube. An economic freedom index of the Heritage Foundation still indicates that there is a high tax burden and that there's a high government spending still. How does that fit into that story? How do we, as people from other countries, have to interpret that?
Yeah, well, I just told you, we make bigger mistakes than others. Sweden still has a larger government than most others. It's around 42% of GDP right now, and our tax burden. But we're not the world champion. Countries like Belgium and France and so on, they're higher up that list now. But that's the one area where Sweden is less economically free than others. If you look at the other indicators, free markets, free trade, no licensing requirements, open product markets, private providers in the public system and so on, Sweden is more free market. And that's, in a way, the social democratic way of doing things. Let's have free markets, let's have free trade, create lots of wealth, and then we can redistribute it. Some of that size might be a bit of an illusion. All the benefits that are given are taxed as well. So you see a sort of a double count. It's not really as large as because the government takes some of it back, but it's very large. But from the left to the right, they've worked quite hard in the last 30 years to try to make these systems and the benefits dependent on what you paid into the system recently. So I think that's problematic. I think there are things that we have to do there, but that's not my main concern right now when it comes to Sweden. That would be the labor market, and that would be some of the control that trade unions have over the labor market. We don't have minimum wages in Sweden or anything like that, but on the major industries, most professions, they're controlled by collective bargaining, and we have very high de facto minimum wages. And that is a disaster. Well, it works quite well when everybody is a molecular biologist and everybody has gone to university and so on. But it works terribly when we have a large refugee population, specifically with people who have not gone through that education and a large segment of them even illiterate. Then you have to open that labor market up. If you have a de facto minimum wage at 70 to 80% of the median wage, then that's a recipe for mass unemployment and social exclusion.
Right. Well, when we talk about the Swedish propensity for experiments, we heard, in the recent days, we've heard, and weeks, we've heard a lot about the Swedish approach to the coronavirus, and we got all the questions in the Q&A are pretty much to that. So Tom Palmer actually asks, could you comment on the Swedish model of social distancing? It has been widely discussed worldwide. Is it connected to a liberal model, or is it very risky? We don't know the outcomes yet, so can you comment on that?
Oh yeah, that's actually the one thing that we're all discussing during dinner and whatever we do right now in Sweden. So I'm glad that's been brought up. And we don't know what's going to happen, and it is risky, but everything is risky right now. It's not like Sweden is the only experiment right now. Germany is an experiment. Great Britain is an experiment. The United States is experimenting dramatically, and so is India and China, because we've never shut down societies, locked down societies and businesses and trade to that extent. And the one thing we do know about the world is that that is dangerous. We don't know what's going to work best when it comes to beating this virus and protecting public health, but we do know that shutting down societies is terrible for the economy and for health. So it is risky, but I wouldn't say that we know for certain that it's more risky than other models. What do I think of it? I think that partly, yes, I think this might be sort of coming from some of our political attitudes as well. We have a more cautious social democracy right now in charge. They govern with the Green Party, and they don't like authoritarian measures, at least when it's not about the environment. And all the flights are already grounded. And they're also supported by two minor free market liberal parties who are very much opposed to harsh authoritarian measures. So that might be one of the reasons. But I also think that it's because of a couple of other things. Sweden has a tradition of a very peculiar, comparatively, system of division of powers. The government agencies and authorities are independent in Sweden. Only Sweden and to some extent Finland, of countries that I know of, have this system. The ministers of government, they put a general director in charge of it, but they are supposed to follow the law and the rules and deal with things. The ministers are not allowed to interfere in particular decisions. And even though they don't have to follow the recommendations of, for example, the Swedish Public Health Authority, that has created a tradition of listening to the agencies and to the experts rather than to the politicians at first. So I think that has given us, Sweden, in contrast to other places, more of less of a need for political grandstanding. For example, health researchers say that travel bans, that's just political placebo. It doesn't help us to beat the virus because the virus is already everywhere. But health expertise and services and goods, medical equipment is not everywhere, and we just ruin that. And Denmark, for example, shuts down its borders anyway, but its public health authority in Denmark says there's no scientific reason to do this. This is just a political decision. Well, in Sweden, we've listened a little bit more to our experts. And I also think that perhaps this brush with economic death in the 1990s, that taught us that it's risky to ruin our economy as a small export-dependent and trade-dependent economy. So that might also be a reason. And what we've done, sorry, I didn't say this, just a brief summary of what Sweden hasn't done compared to other places. We haven't shut down the schools, the preschools, the kindergartens, the restaurants, the bars, the gyms, the parks, the shopping centers, and so on. They've banned public events, including 50 people or more. But not even spontaneous gatherings of 50 persons can be broken up by police in Sweden. So the advice from the Swedish government is have some social distancing, If you don't have to go to work, if you can do it on a distance, do it. Don't, and people over 70 shouldn't socialize at all. But that's about it. And here comes the last then connection to Sweden's cultural history. We are still a fairly small, homogeneous population with trust in authorities and in others. If they recommend something, we listen to it and we abide by it. And that, I think, might be, we'll see how this works out, but this might be the sort of the golden middle in a way. People don't go to restaurants. They don't travel for Easter to their summer homes in Sweden. It's fairly desolate, no matter what you've seen when foreign journalists and correspondents have sort of taken pictures of the 2 restaurants where there are lots of people in Stockholm still. That's not the case. People are socially distancing in Sweden in a spontaneous way, but it's not the law. And that gives you some room for local knowledge and for individual needs, which the center would never be able to sort of predict. But we can do that. We know that we shouldn't do it, but if it's incredibly important to me, I can do it. And that might be the best middle way. We'll see.
Right. Yeah, we will definitely find out, as the broad brush of government is usually not the best way to paint that nuanced painting in the end of the day. Well, there's also some questions coming in. How do you see the conflict between some companies now around the world being shut down and obviously demanding compensation for that, because the shutdown does not come from their own operation, not their entrepreneurial thinking or something like that.
Yeah.
How do you see that, and the conflict between pretty much a political minority setting the rules and the economy, which is consists of all of us, has to bear the cost? How do you see that playing out also in other countries?
Yeah, I'm still battling with myself over this. I hate any kind of government bailout of industries, of businesses, of the economy, but this time might be different in certain ways. This is not an instance of businesses generally being uncompetitive and therefore the government gives them resources. It's not the case, as it was during the financial crisis, that they made terrible mistakes like many financial corporations and banks, and therefore the government gave them lots of resources. This is an instance of lots of competitive businesses that could have been having a good time by now, but they're being shut down, and they are being shut down by the government, recommending or forcing them to close down or to keep as many people as possible out. And in that case, I would have to say that they owe them something. What we're doing right now is that we're not socializing businesses because the government is not taking them over, but we're giving them a ban on existence. Could be a death penalty, basically. And then I think that we owe them something. And I think that there is a role for government in that case to compensate them. Do I think that this will be done in a reasonable way, so as not giving the most to those who have the most political connections and the best PR and the lobbyists? Not at all. That's going to happen, definitely. But I do see struggling people who have put their lives and all their resources and all their dreams into hard work, and it's being ruined overnight without any debate by these decisions. And in that case, I think that they're owed something. There might be a role for a more general, I think, attempt to help businesses to sort of survive this hopefully brief period of social distancing, or even quarantines, national ones as well. I would prefer that to happen through a general tax holiday, so that I don't think it's a good idea to send the most resources to those who are doing worst. I know we'll have this debate. So you're helping businesses that are doing well. yeah, but they're doing well for a reason. It's not like we should always help those who are doing worst because it might be a lack of foresight, no margins. They've borrowed too heavily during a zero interest rate environment, for example. A general tax holiday, as long as this goes on, why not?
Doing the research for this interview, I came across your research on how and why to look forward to the next coming years, on basically the reasons on why to be an optimist. Now we're in those times with a lot of uncertainty, with stories about death and suffering. Why should we be optimistic about the future?
I'm glad you asked that question, because it seems difficult right now, right? But being an optimist, being a rational optimist, to use Matt Ridley's phrase, because that's an important distinction, I think. Being an optimist seems like, yeah, everything will turn out for the best. We don't know that, but I'm a rational optimist. As long as people are free to experiment with new knowledge and ideas and put them into effect with new technologies and business models, I'm pretty certain that life will go on in a good way. And the reason why I'm an optimist right now is pretty obvious. This is the best time ever to have a pandemic. You wouldn't want a pandemic ever, obviously, but we'll have them, and we've always had them back in the past as well. But what happened back then was not just during the Black Plague and the Spanish flu. We had them in the 20th century several times, of flu seasons that killed millions around the world. Was that they worked their way slowly through the world population, but steadily, just going on and on across the world until they've killed every vulnerable person. Well, now they're up against the best brains on the planet who've connected themselves through the internet and compare notes constantly on the best treatment, on the best therapeutics, the best drugs, the best vaccines, and to keep the economy going as well in other ways. Now we discuss things like the lack of ventilators in hospitals, and that's a reasonable discussion. But in 1950, we didn't have one single ventilator on the planet.
Right.
Now we can read the virus genome in 6 days, but until 1995, it had never been done on the planet, on planet Earth. So it tells you that this, for the first time, we have a fighting chance against something like this. And that's because we have more eyeballs looking at the world's problems than ever. And with some luck, unless we screw this up big time politically, they will also be more free to experiment with new models, new knowledge, new drugs, new therapeutics to deal with it. So that's why I'm an optimist. I'm not a rational optimist because I don't think the world will not face problems in the future. It's that we're getting better at dealing with those problems than ever before.
How do you see the government and the free market in that picture? Like, because from what I've seen, is that the free market comes up with marvelous solutions to problems we cannot even think of, and that we are, if it's left to its own devices, it can work the most properly. Being a rational optimist, do you see any like threats to that liberty of the markets? Do you see any threats which could make you a little bit more pessimistic, at least in the short run?
Oh yeah. And this is why I'm not what a friend of mine calls extreme optimism. And extreme optimism, it is the idea that things will turn out well even if people don't listen to me. I'm not that kind of an optimist. People have to listen to me, and they have to abide by at least a certain degree of liberal ideas. Open markets, open minds, an open world. Otherwise, we won't be this successful in the long run. We'll be lucky. Sorry, it's my cat just trying to interfere. I'm hopeful that as long as people are free, they'll do this. I'm not necessarily an optimist when it comes to the question, will people be free in the future? We've seen some very problematic trends around the world in recent years: authoritarian, populist, nationalist, and socialist reactions against an open world and an open market. And historically, pandemics enforce those trends. If you look at our history, and actually this is very timely, but I have a book coming out in September called Open, the Story of Human Progress, where I discuss this, how historically openness creates all these wonderful solutions to our problems, but every time we've had a major crisis, foreign invasions, financial crisis, pandemics, historically during the last 2000 years, we've in most cases have these authoritarian reactions because people think that they have to circle their wagons, they have to shut the borders, they have to have someone in charge, they need a strong man who tell us what to do when we're worried. And I definitely see this happening right now. We see some politicians using this crisis as an excuse just to grab power, the Viktor Orbáns or the Putins of the world doing that right now. But we also have this creeping attempt to control things, control matters, to governments like France's government suddenly confiscating necessary medical equipment just because it crossed their borders at the moment. Democratic governments beginning to try to pinpoint the location of every person because they might be infected and we want to know where they are at that point. So we will certainly see this tendency now. Do we know that they'll hand that power gladly and willingly back to citizens after this crisis is over? That's not what we learned from history. So your task, my task, the task for all of us to talk about how to bring forth the case for liberty gets more important than ever, I'd say, in the coming years.
All right. We are 2 minutes away from 7 p.m. and there's still some miscellaneous questions in the chat. How optimistic are you that you can find some extra time to answer them?
Well, being a rational optimist, I'll give you another 15 minutes.
15 minutes. All right. Well, we'll try to make the best use of that. There's a question on YouTube basically saying the social security system in Sweden is still one of the best in Europe. Leaves open what best in this case means. Is that a socialism benefit, or like a benefit of socialism for that matter?
Right, good question. But first, we're going to have to make a distinction. When I mentioned social security before, I used it in the American sense, the pension system in Sweden, which I think is one of the best pension systems in the world. And that's because we dismantled the socialist pension system, which was going bankrupt in the early 1990s. It was obvious to see if you have a pay-as-you-go system where those who work right now, they pass their money along to the older generation. Well, those money aren't invested, and whenever there's a demographic shift and too few working, people won't get what they've been told that they would get. Sweden changed this into a system with some individual accounts, and for the rest of it, it's just defined what you put into the system, not what you're getting, which is great because it tells you you'll get something. It's not that it'll collapse and that politicians can change this just because they have financial problems and want to put the money somewhere else. When it comes to what we often talk about in other circumstances in Europe, when we phrase it social security, the kind of security that people are getting from a welfare state in other contexts. Sweden is still more generous than many other countries. We have more of, well, the brief summary is that we're very generous to families with kids,
right? And
we give them lots of stuff. It's almost for free childcare, the school, the universities, and so on. And you also have a very generous parental leave stuff. So it's basically a subsidy of having kids. Is this sort of version of the welfare state? Is that why we're doing well when it comes to, fairly well at least, when it comes to health and lack of poverty and so on? I don't know. The interesting thing is that there is an almost natural experiment. We have almost more Swedes or descendants of Swedes and Scandinavians in the United States than in Sweden and Norway and Denmark. And they rank even higher than we do when it comes to health, when it comes to lack of poverty and different difficult personal circumstances like that. They even rank higher when it comes to interpersonal trust than we do. So it tells you something else. They don't have the Swedish welfare state over there. It might be something about the kind of work ethic and interpersonal trust that was being built sometime between the Viking trade and raid history to the laissez-faire system in the 19th and early 20th century in Sweden, before they left Sweden at around the turn of the last century. Something that happened back then explains it rather than the welfare state.
All right, another question from Mohammed Maleri. Did the entry of Sweden into the European Union help it become more liberal, or did it harm it? Like, as on the liberal point of view?
Yes and no. To some extent, it hurt us, because suddenly Sweden, which has been historically a free trade country, even during the craziest days, Sweden always had an open market and tried to always push businesses into the steel bath of international competition. And that's one of the reasons why they could never become lazy or monopolies in Sweden. They always had to be world champions, because they always faced that competition. When we joined the European Union in 1995, we had to implement some 10,836 different tariffs. So it definitely made Sweden less of a free trade country. On the other hand, it gave us access to the European market without tariffs and without all these backdoor protectionism that different standards resulted in. So it's difficult to say on net what that meant. I think for the economy as a whole, it meant that, yeah, we became a little bit less free trade, but it meant that most businesses got less tariffs because their greatest trading partner was definitely other European countries. But we had to, for example, re-regulate agriculture. As one of few countries, Sweden had, and this was during this was the Social Democrats in Sweden who did this, because they weren't allied with the farmers associations and their trade associations, and they didn't have those voters. So they deregulated agriculture and forced them to compete on an open market. With the EU membership, we suddenly had to re-regulate it and pay lots of subsidies to our farmers. So it's been good and it's been bad. I would say that on the whole, I used to be an opponent of Swedish EU membership because I objected to these new rules and regulations, standards and tariffs. But with time, I've learned, and especially having experienced it through the eyes of different Swedish businesses, I've learned how incredibly important it is to get rid of all that backdoor protectionism, all those different standards that different authorities say that, oh, it's just for the security of the consumer that we have to regulate this vacuum cleaner in this particular way. Well, it just so happens that it only works then for a German vacuum cleaner or a Swedish one or something like that. Well, when 27 or so countries have to agree on a standard, I don't think a standard is reasonable at all. I think that if another country, if the US has said that this is an okay vacuum cleaner, well, it's good enough for me, let me make that decision. But that's not the alternative. The alternative is a Swedish or a German standard. Well, then I much prefer the EU standard, because then it has to be broad enough to include the competition from all these different European countries. And what I've seen from a business perspective in Sweden is that it's given Swedish businesses much more freedom to to trade and to produce and innovate. So to that extent, even though I'm not happy about all of it from an ideological perspective, from an economic perspective, it's probably given us interesting degrees of freedom.
All right. Why do Sweden's social democrats still call themselves social democrats? Because they seem so entirely different from some other continental European social democrats or the social democrats emerging in the US.
Do you remember the Spice Girls? Or any kind of...
Yep. Yes.
Are you old enough to listen to their music?
See, I'm probably too young to have the full knowledge of them, but I know they existed.
You've seen the pictures.
I've seen it.
Their point, and this is the point of every girl band and boy band, is that you are supposed to identify with one of them. One is Sporty Spice, not, yeah, I'm a sporty girl, so I like them. One is Posh Spice, and yeah, I'm like that, and so on. That's what the Social Democrats in Sweden are all about. That's why they've been in charge of Sweden since 1932, with a few brief interludes. They've been experts in having a couple of different representatives whom everybody can sort of identify with. They have some semi-communists who are there and they say these crazy things, and that's enough for some segment of the Swedish population to vote for them. Sort of, yeah, I'm like that. And at the same time, we've had some economists there, and especially around the Ministry of Finance, who have been much more classically liberal and free market than center-right parties have been in Sweden. So obviously then another segment of the Swedish population can say, yeah, I trust them to do the right thing in the end, and you'll hear all this sound and fury from the others, but they are the ones who are really in charge. And as one Minister of Industry and Social Democrat Björn Rosengren put it, the success formula of Swedish Social Democrats is to sort of yell in leftish, but then govern center-rightish constantly, and that's what we do. Then they need that name. If this is the story, they need the name, they need that tradition to show that we're still sort of the traditional labor movement party in Sweden. And they do have that. And when the times are changing in a leftish perspective, they are the first one to begin to talk about socializing business again. But when times are more liberal, then they become free marketeers. They are experts in shape shifting to that extent. But anyone who's shape shifting and constantly trying out a new outfit, they also need a good historical narrative about who they are and where they come from, to show that they are not just the flavor of the month. They are a serious party, and then they need to keep that name, whatever they do next.
All right. Do you think, so what do you think is the future of the social democratic system, quote unquote, if the tax burden is still that high? Do you see that changing in any near future?
I think that this period, I divided Swedish history in a couple of periods. It's like 1850 to 1950, that's the classical liberal period. Then we began to socialize, and until the 1990s, that was the socialist period. Then we had a new, or the semi-socialist period. They never really socialized the means of production. And then from 1995, we had a reform period. Well, that ended. That has ended. You can discuss when that happened. It's been a couple of backs and forth, but it has definitely ended. And since the Social Democrats returned to power in 2014, they have increased a couple of taxes here and there. They're not moving in the other direction. I don't see that changing soon. I see problems personally when it comes to the opposition right now, which is the big sort of center-right liberal conservative moderate party, which used to be a fairly strong free market party. They are now somehow trying to find a way to create an alternative together with the nationalist populists. They're not saying it aloud, but that is what's happening right now. And they are not just sort of an ugly remnant of the Swedish neo-Nazi movement, the Sweden Democrats, but they're also social democrats who don't like immigrants, basically. And they might change their policies back and forth a little bit to look like they might cooperate with the moderate party or not. But that's not the key. That's not what they're doing. They're nostalgic about the traditional social democratic model. When they're being asked, they say we're right-wing when it comes to culture, meaning stop people from experimenting culturally and innovating, and we're right-wing when left-wing when it comes to the economy, meaning we like from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, as their boss actually quoted Louis Blanc and later on Marx, who said the same thing. So in a weird way, we've now seen a previously sort of free market moderate party who's been opposed to social democrats because they haven't spent enough on social services, who have been complaining about attempts to privatize many of the labor market agencies that the social democrats had to do because they were supported by these smaller liberal parties. So there's, for the moment, no strong liberal challenge to the welfare state in Sweden. And that will be a problem in the future. It's not a problem for the moment, but when the downturn comes in a big way, we're going to have to be dealing with that.
All right, this brings us probably to our last question. How would you say, what is the current zeitgeist in Sweden like? Is it more individualistic? Is it more collectivist? What is the deal?
We are all individualists in a paradoxical Life of Brian kind of way. People, have this attitude, some call it state individualism, that even when we grew our economy larger, people wanted to do it in a way so as to set us free from one another. Swedes, even the social democrats, they don't really like the collectivist government sort of forming us, molding us into one great collective. It's more like, yeah, hand me a check and in cash, so that I can decide what to do with it myself. And it gives me some freedom from family and relatives and so on. That is the Swedish, that has for a long time been the Swedish zeitgeist, I think. I think that this way of responding to the coronavirus situation right now is in a way in line with this. We don't like being forced to do anything. We're happy to oblige if we're being recommended, and then we'll abide by it in most instances. But there would, and Swedes seem to support this policy right now, at least. So we've got that right now, but politically, it's not been translated into any kind of forceful liberal libertarian challenge against big government in Sweden. That's not the kind of individualism that we had. It's more of a cultural individualism than anything else. And at the same time, there's a fear that I have, and when I study history and all the research that I did for my book, Open, tells me that in times of crisis and in times of pandemics, people become more collectivist. They become more authoritarian and more nationalist. I think that's going to happen around the world, and I fear that that's going to happen in Sweden as well. So what I'm thinking about right now is how to deal with that, how to battle against that. And I think we all have to do that, no matter which country we are in.
Well, I guess if we're up to that challenge, there is a rational reason to be optimistic for the future. This was the last question, and this was our 4th episode of the Spring of Liberty here at Students for Liberty Germany. We thank everybody for coming, and we also thank you for being this excellent speaker. This wouldn't be possible without our excellent speakers, but also without the team, which is behind us and working for everybody. So thank you for that. We will continue with this series in about in 1 week exactly, when we talk about alternatives to the national state in terms of free private cities, which is going to be a very, very interesting talk by Titus Gebel. And everybody who was in that call is invited to attend it, obviously, next week as well. And our invitation is, also goes out to you, Johan, to join us as, for example, other previous speakers like Tom Palmer did today. All right. With that, thank you very much, and we will see you next